Hi, my name is Jared and this is Horror Obsession. Today, I want to talk about Stranger Things Season 2. The Duffers had a massive hit on their hands with Season 1, and the show generated an intense amount of buzz and hype. But there are countless shows that had a strong first season only to fall off for subsequent seasons, so I wanted to take a look at what the Duffers did to keep the show fresh and engaging. We're going to have to get into spoilers, so let's just jump in. I think Season 2 is kind of underrated, mostly because there is a certain episode which everyone hates and it feels extremely out of place. If you go to StrangerThingsFandom.com and go to the summary for Season 2, they literally do not even include the episode in the summary, and there is no mention of it at all. This goes to show how hated this episode is among Stranger Things fans, and for good reason. It literally feels like an episode from a different TV show. The entire episode is focused on this weird side story, and it never connects to anything again besides 11 leveled up her powers, which could have been accomplished a million different ways that actually pushed the narrative forward. It is so jarring that when I do a rewatch, I generally just skip the episode, and I gotta say, the story is much better this way. Anytime you can completely eliminate an hour-long episode from a show and it makes a story much more streamlined and logical, you've got a problem on your hands. The episode itself is not necessarily terrible, it is just the tone is so different from the rest of the show, and the aesthetics are so different, and the characters are way different, so in that sense it is kind of terrible, I guess. I mean, you've got 11 who is considering hunting down and murdering a bunch of people with this weird goth group. I don't know what they were thinking, but let's talk about the stuff that feels like a Stranger Things show. The characters were the best part of Season 1, and I have no doubt the Duffers realize that as well. As a reminder, the main three groups of characters were the kids, aka Mike, Dustin, Lucas, 11, the teenagers, Nancy, Steve, Jonathan, and the adults, Joyce and Hopper. The Duffers already explored the dynamics of these exact character interactions, and keeping the groups exactly the same would likely lead to things feeling stale. They identified this even in Season 1, and mixed things up by having all the groups come together at the end so we could see how characters who had never met might interact, for example, Eleven and Joyce. The Duffers could have tried to keep things fresh by mixing up the characters within the groups, and they do this to some extent in Season 2, but the main thing they do is introduce a bunch of new characters. It makes sense to have at least one new character in each group, and that is exactly what we got. So let's recap which characters get introduced in Season 2. I love the way Max is introduced. Having a character move from California to small town America has been a trope forever, and I think it is fun that the Duffers introduce Max this way. This creates certain expectations for her character. For example, she is the only time we see a skateboard in the show, and she's riding it all the time, but they create a very interesting subversion. The boys see Dustin's Dig Dug score has been beaten, and the name is Mad Max, and just like the boys, the audience first thinks this must be a boy. When they learn Max is a girl, they immediately become enamored with her, which creates a great conflict between Lucas and Dustin, and eventually Max herself. The kid group would have felt kind of weird as they age up if there were no girls besides 11, so introducing Max was a smart decision for that reason. Beyond that, Max is just a very interesting and enjoyable character played wonderfully by Sadie Sink. Max's brother, Billy, who we'll get to in a second, is aggressive and abusive and kinda hates Max. Her parents don't really like her much either, and so she has a pretty rough history, though we learn more about that in Season 4. When the boys first meet her, she is sarcastic and kind of mean, but also intelligent. She figures out they are following her and watching her, and leaves a note in the garbage for them to find because she was observant enough to notice that they were waiting for her to throw something away. As the kids get to know her better, we realize she is actually kind and funny, and the sarcasm is a shield she uses to protect herself from her traumatic past. And she is actually lonely and yearns for social connection and a group to accept her. She is a great match with the boys and also plays the role of the skeptic. She wasn't there for Season 1, so she doesn't know anything about what happened, and I love the scene where Lucas is explaining everything that went down, and she's like, that's dumb, come on. This once again shows the realistic writing which defines the Duffers' characters. It would have been too easy to have Max be like, oh wow, that's so crazy, I'm so glad you're all okay. But instead we get more sarcastic, defensive Max, which is totally in line with what we know about her already. Her guard is always up, and they do eventually prove to her what they are saying is real, but it takes actual evidence instead of just Lucas saying stuff. I love Max, and she becomes an integral part of the group moving forward, and her introduction is a huge part of what makes Season 2 work so well. I promised I would talk about Billy, so here we go. Billy is not quite as strong of a character as he becomes in Season 3, but he is already pretty good. Much like Max, he is introduced in kind of a stereotypical way. The bad boy driving the fast car and kind of just being a jerk to everyone. He tries to run the kids off the road when they're on their bikes, which I think is a very good way to characterize him. He is reckless, doesn't care about other people or their safety, is doing something dangerous directly to the group of kids we love, but it isn't comic book villain level bad. He would have just enough plausible deniability that if he was caught, he could turn on the charm and lie and say he didn't see them or something. Exactly the situation smart bullies put themselves in. Billy makes even more sense as a character once we see his dad abusing him later, which turns him into more of a tragic character. I'm not saying being abused completely absolves him of the responsibility he has for being a racist and hating Lucas for being black, or for kind of trying to kill the kids by running them off the road, but it does make his villain arc more believable and turns him into a more sympathetic character. I haven't even mentioned it yet, but he also fights Steve for the so-called King of the School crown, which is a weird subplot that doesn't really go anywhere except humbling Steve, though I think that is just enough characterization to make these scenes not a waste of time. The Duffers wanted to establish Billy as a powerful villain, and it makes sense to have Steve be the one to stand up to him. This happens at first on the basketball court, but later when Billy shows up to the Byers' house looking for Max and finds Steve there. The popularity contest conflict between Steve and Billy is one thing, but having Billy find Steve at a house when he's looking for his little sister is certainly suspicious, especially considering Steve won't let him into the house. Billy beating the shit out of Steve also elevates him as a villain, as surely none of the kids would stand a chance against him in a fight. Dacre Montgomery plays Billy amazingly well, and he shifts between scary Billy and charming Billy with alarming ease, really showing off his range as an actor. This is on full display when he is being abused by his father, but then goes to the Wheeler house and immediately charms Karen into giving him the Byers' address. I love this scene because Billy is totally believable as the concerned older brother looking for his sister, the role Billy is playing, even though we the audience totally understand his true nature. I mentioned this before, but the best bullies operate this way, showing one face to the world and another to their victims, and this scene also sets up a subplot in season 3, but I'll save that for the next video. The introduction of Billy as a character is totally an underrated part of season 2, and in combination with Max, took Stranger Things in a whole new direction and forever changed the dynamic and trajectory of the show. And I haven't even talked about Bob yet. So Max was introduced to spice things up with the kids group, and Billy for the teenager group, so who was added to spice things up for the adult group? Bob, of course. Bob is such a great addition to the story. The fact he went to school with Joyce and had a crush on her for a long time is such simple characterization, but it makes the world of Hawkins feel that much more real. It makes it feel as though things have been going on in this world for a really long time, even if they never happen on screen. This seems so simple, but is very effective world building, and of course we see a completely different side of Joyce. As I mentioned in the last video, she was a bit one note as the hysterical mother in season 1, so season 2 was bound to mix it up a bit. Bob is a stabilizing force for Joyce, and while he is a bit boring and kind of corny, she is searching for someone exactly like that so she can have some normalcy back in her life, and give her sons, and herself, their best chance at happiness.
Why is this so hard to explain? This is not a normal family.
It could be.
The Duffers continue with their masterful writing by having Bob be the one to solve what the tunnel drawings are, which makes sense in the context of what we already know about him. He was a bit of a tech nerd in school and works at a tech store currently, so him being good at solving puzzles fits well. This is also the way they draw Bob into the main mystery of the narrative, and it doesn't feel forced or contrived at all. Through most of the season, Bob is unaware of the spooky supernatural stuff from season 1, so when he gives Will the terrible advice of confronting the Mind Flayer, that actually makes sense too. Bob is thinking this is a dream Will is having, and he thinks he is teaching Will to confront his past trauma, which would be generally pretty good advice if this were the real world. Unfortunately for Bob, he tells Will to confront an extremely dangerous extra-dimensional mind-control demon thing, so it doesn't go great, but he had good intentions at least. I can't talk about Bob without mentioning his untimely death at the end of the season, which serves two functions. The first is to pave the way for Joyce's will they, won't they romance with Hopper to continue in future seasons, but also continues to show that the Stranger Things world is dangerous and characters are not safe. Much the same way the Barb death, the Benny death, and the random elevator scientist death did in season 1. Most of season 2 is pretty chill and laid back, and they only ratchet up the tension towards the end of the season, and honestly killing Bob was a pretty big gut punch. I was expecting him to take over as the father figure to Will and Jonathan, but instead, he gets eaten by dogs. The Duffers sure do know how to surprise the audience, and I mean that in a good way, not in the Last Jedi subvert expectations way. Last but not least, I wanted to talk about Murray, who was introduced early on in the season as a private detective Barb's parents hired, but ends up becoming much more than that. Murray is one of my favorite characters in the entire show, and in combination with Max, Billy, and Bob, Season 2 is absolutely on fire with building on the characters from Season 1. Murray is logical, pragmatic, and understands how the world works. The section of the show where he is guiding Nancy and Jonathan on what to do with the story is one of my favorite sequences in all of Stranger Things. He always drinks vodka when he needs to think, but the straight vodka is too strong, so he needs to water it down.
Perfect.
We water it down.
Precisely. Perhaps Barbara was exposed to some dangerous toxins.
A leak from the lab.
This ends up being a metaphor for watering the story down, which Murray suggests they do by removing any supernatural element to the story and saying it was a toxic chemical spill and sending that to the Chicago Sun, where he used to work. Not only is this a great idea to get people to believe them, but also is perfectly in line with Murray's character. Let's quickly check in with what is going on with our old characters, starting with 11. She has been hidden from everyone else for an entire year, and Hopper has been very careful to make sure no one finds her. This makes sense since Hopper is still scarred from the death of his daughter and is not taking any chances with his de facto new daughter. 11 has been starved of attention her entire life and finally was making friends before being forced to isolate from them, which would be extremely frustrating. Pairing these two together works wonders for advancing their philosophical conflict, the essence of any quality character conflict. They both have good intentions, but those intentions and goals conflict with one another, so they end up fighting over it. 11 going to see Mike at school and mistaking his conversation with Max as being flirty is also in line with her character. After all, she doesn't have a ton of experience with anyone, let alone boyfriends. She lashes out, which is a reflection of her violent upbringing, and then she goes on her little side quest and finds her lost sister, where we spend an entire episode with her learning to use emotions to guide her powers, which is basically exactly what she already did at the end of Season 1. It is such a waste of screen time, and everything 11 does after would have been believable based on what we already knew of her character from before, so I really wish they just focused on leveling her up through her relationship with Mike or Hopper or something. Really, anything would have been better. Let's just move on and talk about Will. Will was kind of absent most of Season 1, doing that whole thing where he was trapped and infected and almost murdered in the Upside Down. So we finally get to see him interact with the main cast, except he has changed from his Upside Down experience, and so we don't really see the real Will until next season either. We do get some characterization of Will in this season though, and the show has consistently explored themes of trauma, so I get why they did it. It also gives Hopper and Joyce a plausible reason to maintain a relationship with Owens, the new doctor at the lab, so it works narratively and ties a lot of the season together. The sacrifice they make for these narrative advancements is to have Will continue to be a pretty superficial character, but he does get a really nice moment later where Jonathan et al. Are telling their favorite stories of Will to try to bring him back from being flayed. Although Will is still a spy after, and it pretty much completely fails, I thought it was pretty touching, and I really enjoyed that scene. Will does instruct everyone to close the gate, which catalyzes the final confrontation, so it isn't like this is a total narrative dead end. But I feel like the group should have guessed closing the gate would be the way to go, but I'm fine with them getting the final motivation to do so from this scene. It's fine. Let's move on. Dustin progresses well in this season and is a bit more mature, and him and Lucas both fawning over Max because she plays arcade games was cute. With all the new characters being introduced and following up on the other characters, they are a little underdeveloped this season, especially towards the end, but we do get a lot of great stuff with them, and Dustin and Steve's bromance really flourishes in this season. Their dynamic is one of the most fun in the entire show, so it is hard to say Dustin doesn't get enough development. In fact, I've talked myself into it. I retract my previous statement. I love Dustin in Season 2, if only because we get the Dustin and Steve stuff. Dustin ends up not getting the girl, and Max goes with Lucas and they end up kissing. And Dustin gets turned down to dance a few times, which is a surprisingly heartbreaking moment in the show. After all the violent carnage of the previous episodes, I wouldn't have thought that a boy being turned down at the dance would end up being one of the more tragic scenes, but here we are. Nancy saves the day, however, and comes to dance with Dustin, which is a nice way to end the season. Yes, I know, we zoom out from the dance to see the flare watching the school from the Upside Down, which is an even better way to end the season and tease that the danger is still there, and that closing the gate was only a temporary setback for the villain, but I really like the snowball scene. Speaking of Nancy, Nancy has kind of a weird season. where the Duffers heard the feedback from the audience that Barb was basically forgotten for most of season 1, and they decided to write Nancy being super torn up about Barb for most of season 2. I am glad they addressed it because far too many writers would have just moved on and hoped the audience did the same. But the Duffers did their penance, and Nancy spends the first few episodes struggling with whether she should tell Barb's parents she is dead. This is quite the predicament considering there is no way to tell them without revealing a bunch of classified information they promised not to say. And while this story culminates with the wonderful Murray scene we discussed earlier, along the way we also get the infamous party scene. Nancy's acting in this scene is a little off, not surprising since I wouldn't be shocked if she has never been drunk before, but still, she is laying it on a little thick.
We're partying. Yeah, let's party, huh? We're partying. It's bullshit.
Perfect.
The party also serves to formally end the Nancy and Steve relationship, and I never really understood why Jonathan and Nancy are into one another. I get Murray's argument about shared trauma and all that, but Nancy had that with Steve too. Their major disagreement is about whether to tell Barb's parents, and I guess she ends up liking Jonathan because he wanted to go along with her plan to tell them. I don't know, Jonathan is kind of the worst character among the main cast, so I've never understood why they get together, but I suppose romance keeps the show moving. This is the only storyline that doesn't really work for me, since we kind of already did the love triangle thing in season 1, but here we are again.
It's bullshit.
There is more to season 2 than the characters, however. While later seasons are more highly regarded among the fans, I think people often forget how much of the groundwork for season 3 and 4 is laid out in season 2. This season is what takes Stranger Things from an isolated story about a group of kids and their parents to being a truly entirely different world, which is exactly what I love in science fiction. The feeling that the world you are watching is real, inhabited, lived in, and different from our own is what draws me to science fiction and fantasy in the first place. The brilliantly written characters provide the backbone, but combining that with the well-written science fiction elements is what propels this show forward. I love when there are little details which explain how some kind of supernatural thing works, and that happens a pretty good amount in season 2, especially because they mostly make sense. When the scientists are burning the tunnels, Owens explains Will's connection to the Upside Down through the Mind Flayer is causing him pain, and perhaps even to die, because all of the creatures in the flare are connected like a hive mind. Not only is this a very plausible and easy to understand explanation, it also is a plot point which drives the narrative forward and causes Joyce to want to exorcise the Mind Flayer demon from Will, and they have deduced from previous scenes that the flare does not like heat, so they try and heat Will up enough to force it out. This goes back to the Duffers' major superpower, giving all of the characters something to do at the end, and tying everything together. Joyce is on Team Save Will, while Hopper is taking Eleven to the gate to close it, and the kids are distracting the Demodogs to open the route for Hopper and Eleven. With a show with so many characters, it can get convoluted and confusing if the storylines don't intersect at the end, and see how easy it was for me to explain? Obviously, there are more details than that, but the overall thrust of the story should be simple to understand and simple to explain. One criticism I do have is the fact that Duffers didn't really have much for the kids to do, so the story ends up with them distracting the Demodogs from Hopper and Eleven, who are the two that are really doing the heavy lifting. Does it count as giving all the characters something to do when Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Max, and Steve are all going to do this one thing? That story kind of felt like where the Duffers just threw the characters that didn't have anything to do. Oh yeah, let's just have all the leftover kids be a distraction. It is fine, and no one is completely forgotten, but it doesn't feel as clear and important as it did in season 1. In terms of expanding on the lore, showing the little pollywog Dustin finds to be a baby Demogorgon is excellent. It gives Dustin and the kids something to do for the middle of the season, and also provides world building for what the Demogorgon's life cycle looks like. One of the most interesting things in Aliens is showing the rest of the xenomorph life cycle. In the first one, we see the egg and the soldier alien thing, but in the second one, it shows the queen, which shows how the eggs are produced. Stranger Things kinda goes a similar route and shows the little pollywog thing getting bigger and bigger and eventually becoming an adolescent Demogorgon, affectionately known as Demodogs.
Demogorgon, dogs, Demodogs. It's like a compound.
The Demogorgon from season 1 was pretty scary, but mostly because the monster was rarely revealed. We didn't get a good look at it until well into the season, and by the time we see it, it has already killed several people. We see the Mind Flayer much earlier in season 2, though to be fair it is pretty scary in and of itself. I actually think in terms of visceral terror, the Mind Flayer is the scariest of any of the season's monsters. The Demogorgon is brutal and violent, the Body Snatcher thing from Season 3 is mostly gross rather than scary, and Vecna is pretty terrifying, but there is something about his form being humanoid that makes him less scary than the Flayer for me. It is just a huge, bizarre, spooky shadow monster, and it is clear you cannot reason with it, and while the Flayer is defeated by 11, really all she did was close the gate. That dude is still there, waiting for any opportunity to come back and start possessing people again. Incredibly scary design, and another part of why I think Season 2 does so wonderfully building on Season 1. I haven't talked about theme much, mostly because there isn't a lot going on that wasn't already addressed in my Season 1 discussion. Will is the embodiment of trauma, since his past abduction into the Upside Down serves as his PTSD Criterion A moment, and it haunts him literally and figuratively. The kids at school think he is weird and a creep, probably because it was reported he died and then he showed up at school again one day, which would be kinda weird to be fair. He is also haunted by his abduction by the vision of the Flayer, and Bob's advice to face his fears is intended to show that sometimes the trauma is too strong and one should not try to face the trauma alone. I can get behind this message, although it is kind of muddled and 11 sort of goes through the opposite journey, learning that through her trauma she can find strength. She does not have a mother anymore, as her mind is gone, but she does have friends and she can harness the negative feelings from her past to protect her friends. Just like Season 1, the themes in Season 2 are the weakest part, except perhaps the boring and played out Nancy-Jonathan love story. Oh, and the Lost Sister, but I've harped on that enough. Overall, Season 2 is excellent. When people talk about this season, I feel like they forget that this is where Billy, Max, Bob, Owens, and Murray are all introduced. All of these characters are integral to Stranger Things being what it is, and the Duffers made an excellent choice expanding the cast. This creates many new, interesting dynamics between characters and ties everything together wonderfully, with the exception of that damn Lost Sisters episode. But honestly, do yourself a favor and just skip it if you do a rewatch. Everything flows much better, there is nothing important you are missing, and the story is way more streamlined. Season 2 has so many characters to develop, a couple get left behind. I haven't talked about Mike much, mostly because the story is pretty boring, and Will is more of a plot device than a character most of the time, but basically everyone else has a ton of great characterization happening. This helps build the world of Hawkins and makes everything feel so much bigger. Bob creates a sense of history for the town, humanizing Joyce and making it feel as though the world has been around for a long time, even when we aren't watching. This draws the viewer in and makes the world much more engaging, and of course the villains are extremely scary and formidable. A story is only as good as its villain, and we get both Billy and the Flayer in this season, both amazing villains in totally different ways. I can't say enough great things about Season 2, and it is the perfect complement to Season 1, especially for someone with a stranger horror obsession.